On May 20th, 2026, Bruce Dern walked the red carpet in a black tuxedo and a Los Angeles Dodgers cap. Beside him stood Laura. Behind them, her 2 children, 3 generations under the same lights. The cameras loved it, but the frame was missing 2 people. Diane Ladd, the woman who had shared both his greatest loss and the daughter now standing beside him, was gone. She had died the year before, and there was another absence, one that went back to 1962. A daughter named Diane Elizabeth, only 18 months old, who was lost in a backyard pool accident while Bruce was across the city at a track meet. This was the man his own teachers at the Actors Studio once said would never be more than the 5th cowboy to the right, the man who killed John Wayne on screen and spent years living with the shadow of that role. The man who stood at 89, with a documentary about his life playing to a full house, and still told a reporter he never became a big star. More than 150 films, 65 years, a Best Actor, an Oscar nomination at 77. And still, how does a man spend 60 years running toward recognition while carrying something no recognition could ever reach? What did endurance actually cost him? In the roles no one remembers, and in the rooms where the people he needed most were no longer there. And why, at 89, does Bruce Dern's story feel less like a celebration and more like a portrait of everything that survives and everything that does not? Before we answer those questions, we need to go back to the beginning, to Kenilworth, Illinois, where a boy was already learning to run. The house in Kenilworth had all the right features. A North Shore address. A father whose name carried weight in rooms that mattered. Dinner guests who shaped policy, ran institutions, and moved the world like they had never questioned their right to be there. From the outside, young Bruce Dern's life looked like a rival. The kind of origin people would one day reach for when they needed to explain how a boy from Illinois ended up with more than 150 film credits and a Best Actor on his shelf. From the inside, it felt like something else. His grandfather was George Dern, governor of Utah, later Secretary of War under Franklin Roosevelt. His family had ties to Archibald MacLeish. His godfather was Adlai Stevenson, twice the Democratic nominee for president. These were not just famous names attached to his childhood. They were the walls of the room he grew up inside. Bruce later recalled that every week, important people joined him for dinner. Senators, lawyers, men who built things, ran things, decided things. The table in Kenilworth was not just a place to eat. It was a daily lesson in what the world expected from a boy with his last name. The path was already drawn. The future had already been shaped. All Bruce had to do was fit inside it. He did not fit, not because he was difficult, not because he was ungrateful. He simply could not locate himself inside the shape they had made. The important men at the table felt further away from him than the people in the kitchen, and he began eating dinner there instead, with a household staff, in a room where nobody seemed to be performing anything for anyone. His mother noticed. She told him it was not proper. There were rules about where a boy from this family sat. There were always rules. He was 11 years old when he started running. Not for a coach. Not for a team. He simply went outside and ran, and something about the act of it settled something in him that the dinner table never had. No important people watching. No future already arranged. Just a body moving through space under its own power, in a direction nobody had chosen for him. He kept running. Through North Shore winters and flat Illinois summers. Through high school at New Trier, where he became genuinely exceptional at the half mile. His best time was 1 minute and 55.8 seconds. That number mattered to him in a way his grandfather's titles never quite did, because he had built it himself, inside his own body, without anyone's help or permission. But the family's expectations did not pause for his running. At 14, his parents sent him to a boarding school in New England. Not a conversation. Not a choice. A decision made by people who believed they were acting in his best interest. The way families like his often believed they were acting in everyone's best interest. The school was part of the shape. So was the University of Pennsylvania, where he enrolled because, as he later said simply, everyone in his family went to Penn. His father was a trustee. There was no athletic scholarship available to him. Because of it, he arrived not as a runner going somewhere, but as a son fulfilling an outline someone else had drawn. He studied journalism. He went to the classes he was supposed to attend. He sat inside a future that had been arranged for him with particular efficiency of families who confused love with architecture. And then, in 1956, something broke open. He began going to movies. Every day, sometimes twice, sitting in the dark in Philadelphia theaters and watching people inhabit lives that Kenilworth had never prepared him for. Something in those rooms reached him in a way Penn had not. People on screen made choices that cost them something. They lived from the inside out. They seemed messy, wounded, human, and free in a way the dinner table had never allowed. He left after 2 years. No degree. No plan his father would have recognized. What he had instead was a direction. Not a career yet. Barely even an intention. More like the same physical pull that had sent him outside at 11 to run through the neighborhood alone. His father did not understand. The disapproval was not explosive. It was steady. A quiet conviction that his son was making a mistake. That the family name meant something. That certain paths existed for a reason. Bruce left for New York anyway. He carried 2 years of Penn behind him, the running inside him, and something the boarding school and dinner table had never trained out of him, the refusal to be placed. He did not know yet what the city would ask of him. He did not know what he would lose that no amount of forward motion could retrieve. He was 20 years old, and the life arranged for him was already receding. He ran toward what came next. He always did. New York did not welcome Bruce Dern. It received him the way it receives everyone who arrives with more conviction than experience. Indifferently, the city had absorbed thousands of young men before him who came with something burning in their chest and very little proof that the burning would matter. Bruce found his way to the actor's studio. In the late 1950s, that was not a small thing. Lee Strasberg and Elia Kazan had built a place that had already helped form the kind of American acting associated with Marlon Brando, James Dean, and Paul Newman. Getting him meant he had been seen by people who were very hard to impress. Staying meant letting them take apart everything he thought acting was. For the first year, Bruce was not allowed to speak. Not as punishment, as method. Strasberg wanted actors to stop indicating emotion and start locating it. The early training was physical, observational, and stripped down. No speeches. No easy display. Only behavior. Only reaction. Only the discipline of learning how to exist in front of other people without performing existence. Strasberg called it being publicly private. For a boy who had grown up watching men at his family's dinner table perform importance, this was not abstract. He had spent childhood observing the difference between a version of a person offered a room and the version that existed when the room emptied. The actor's studio gave him language for something he had already been studying without knowing it had a name. He stayed. He did the work. After 2.5 years of training, he was ready to go west. Along the way, he appeared in the original Broadway production of Sweet Bird of Youth, which opened on March 10, 1959, at the Martin Beck Theater in New York. A small role, but enough to prove he could hold his place in a professional room. He moved to Los Angeles in the early 1960s. The work was small at first. Television, guest appearances, Lancer, Gunsmoke, Mission Impossible, The Face in the background. The name in the small print. He showed up. He took what was offered. He brought the same seriousness to small roles that he had brought to the actor's studio, even when the material did not ask for it. And in 1960, in New York, before the move was had fully taken shape, he met Diane Ladd. She was an actress. They met in the world of theater, in that strange closeness where people are already trained to find what is real inside what is performed. They recognized something in each other. They married that same year. By 1961, they had a daughter. They named her Diane Elizabeth. She had her mother's name. She was 18 months old, still at the age when a child is more presence in biography, more sound in a house than anything you can yet point to and call a future. She was the future. In 1962, Bruce was at a track meet at the Los Angeles Coliseum. Running was still part of him. It had always been part of him. He was in the middle of competition when his name came over the public address system. He was told to go to the desk. A plainclothes police officer was waiting. The officer told him what had happened at the house. Diane Elizabeth had found a spoon. She had used it to work open the latch on the gate that led to the backyard pool. The details of what followed belong to the category of things that resist being written, not because they are unclear, but because clarity itself can feel like a violation. By the time anyone understood what the silence in the backyard meant, it was already too late. When Bruce got home, his daughter had been placed on a bed. She was gone. He has spoken about this across the decades with the careful economy of a man who knows exactly how much of a wound can be released into language before the wound becomes something else. In the 2026 documentary Dern, he said the thing he has always said: when the subject comes up, you never get over it. Not you learn to live with it. Not time heals. Not the wound closes. You never get over it. Present tense. Ongoing. The way a runner describes a course he is still on. Think about that sentence coming from this particular man. Bruce Dern had spent 2.5 years learning how to locate real feeling inside a performance. He had built an entire method around the idea that truth, actual interior truth, was the only thing worth putting on screen. And then 1962 gave him a truth so private, so total, and so impossible to shape that no method could touch it. No training, no technique, no amount of being publicly private could contain what it meant to drive home from a track meet to a house where your 18-month-old daughter had just been placed on a bed. You carry that differently than you carry other things. You carry it into every room you enter for the rest of your life, into every audition, every set, every marriage, every morning run before the city wakes up. It is there, not always in the foreground, not always loud, but present, the way an old injury is present even on days when it does not slow you down. The body remembers. They did not fall apart immediately. People rarely do after the worst thing. Life insists on continuing even when continuation feels almost impossible. Diane Ladd was still there. The marriage was still there. Laura was born in 1967, during the years when both of them were still trying to build a future after the future had already shown them what it could take. But something had changed in the air of the house after 1962. Not loudly, not in a way that announced itself as damage. Something quieter and more persistent. The atmosphere of two people who had tried to hold something together and found that the holding had changed them. Diane Ladd would say later that losing Diane Elizabeth was the wound beneath every other wound. That the divorce, when it finally came in 1969, was not really about the things divorces are usually said to be about. It was about two people who had reached the limit of what together could hold. Bruce kept running, through the television episodes, through the small film parts, through the credits most people never wrote down. He ran because stopping, for a man built the way he was built, was not available to him. And he carried 1962 forward, not as an excuse, not as a wound he displayed, as a fact about the interior of a man that no camera ever fully captured and no role ever fully contained. He never stopped. He just kept going. Hollywood looked at Bruce Dern and made a decision. It did not take long. The industry has always been efficient at deciding what a face is for. And Bruce Dern's face, with its sharp angles, its interior intensity, and its refusal to arrange itself into anything easily reassuring, read to the industry as one thing almost immediately: danger. Not the theatrical kind. Not the villain with music, shadow, and a costume that tells the audience exactly what to feel. The quieter kind. The kind that sits across the table from you and seems ordinary until the moment it does not. The industry recognized that quality and put it to work. Television first. Through the early and middle 1960s, Bruce accumulated credits that almost nobody wrote down and almost everybody recognized. Gangsters, cowards, soldiers who broke under pressure, neighbors whose smiles were slightly wrong. He moved through Gunsmoke, Lancer, the FBI, Mission Impossible, appearing again and again as a face you did not want to see when a door opened on screen. He was good at it, not because he played villains with contempt, because he played them with logic. He found the place inside a character where behavior made sense, even when behavior was indefensible. That was the actor's studio in him. The truth of a person was not the same as the likability of a person. His job was not to make audiences comfortable. It was to make them believe. He made them believe. The problem was that audiences believed it too well. They saw the face. They felt the unease. And they filed Bruce Dern accordingly. Alfred Hitchcock noticed something different. In 1964, Hitchcock cast him in Marnie, a film about obsession, psychological damage, and the cruelty of people who use love as a mechanism of control. It was a small part, but it mattered. Hitchcock did not cast faces accidentally. If Bruce was in that room, it meant Hitchcock had seen something in him that television had been using without fully understanding: the ability to carry psychological complexity without explaining it. Bruce was paying attention. Then came 1966 and The Wild Angels. Roger Corman's motorcycle film was loud, unapologetic, and built to give audiences chaos on two wheels in the California sun. It cost approximately $362,000 to make and became one of American International Pictures' most successful releases of that year. It also gave Bruce Dern his first genuinely major film role, and it gave him something else. Diane Ladd was in the cast. They had married 6 years earlier. They had lost Diane Elizabeth 4 years before this film began shooting. And somewhere in the making of The Wild Angels, Laura was conceived, which means one of the first commercially important films of Bruce's career was also the film during which the family he and Diane were trying to rebuild quietly continued. Life does not organize itself around narrative convenience. It simply continues. The Wild Angels confirmed what television had already taught the industry. Bruce Dern was a face that produced a reliable emotion, not sympathy, not comfort, something closer to wariness. The instinctive alertness a body produces when it senses that the person in front of it cannot be fully trusted. He leaned into it, not because he wanted to be hated, because he had no interest in making himself easier to watch. The work Strasberg had built in him was not the kind of work that produces charming. It was the kind that produces true. And true, in the characters he was being offered, looked like this: men at the edge of what society could contain, men whose damage moved through rooms before they said a word, men the audience was relieved to see punished by the final reel. He played them all. He made them all real. And then came 1972, The Cowboys, and the moment that would follow him for the rest of his career. John Wayne. The Cowboys was a Western, the genre that had built Wayne into something beyond a movie star. By then, Wayne carried a particular American idea of masculine virtue: strength without apology, authority without doubt, the man who did what needed to be done and asked nothing except to be left alone to do it. Bruce Dern's character killed him. Not in a fair fight. Not in the kind of showdown westerns traditionally used to pass power from one generation to the next. His character shot Wayne in the back. It was a betrayal designed to make the audience feel something uglier than suspense. Outrage. It worked exactly as intended. It worked almost too well. For years after Cowboys, Bruce Dern existed in the American imagination as the man who killed John Wayne. Not the character. Not the actor playing a role written by someone else. Him. The face. The same face that had been making audiences uneasy since the television years was now attached to one of the most unforgivable acts a Western could imagine. He has spoken about it with the dry humor of a man who has had 50 years to make peace with something he cannot change. Audiences did not always separate performance from performer. Some of them were very clear about how they felt. And yet, underneath the hate mail, the typecasting, and the years of being the face America trusted itself to despise, something else was happening. He was getting better. Every villain, every coward, every man the script reduced to a function, Bruce brought the full weight of his training to bear. He found the interior logic. He located the humanity. He made each one real in ways the role did not always require, and the audience did not always want. Somewhere in the middle of those years, a sentence followed him. The fifth cowboy to write. That was a ceiling his own teachers had once seen for him. Not a leading man, not even a supporting player who steals scenes. The fifth cowboy. Background. Functional. Present without matching. Bruce heard that sentence. He went back to work. He did not argue. He did not soften his edges. He did not try to make the quality of his strangeness more palatable to the rooms that controlled his future. He simply returned to the thing he had always done. He showed up. He prepared. He found the truth inside whatever material he had been handed. The fifth cowboy. He kept showing up anyway. There's a kind of damage that does not arrive all at once. It does not announce itself. It does not come with one dramatic scene both people can later point to and say, that was when everything changed. It comes slowly, through the small gaps grief leaves in a marriage when two people are too busy surviving to examine what survival is costing them. Bruce Dern and Diane Ladd had been married since 1960. They had built a life the way two young actors build lives, around work, uncertainty, and the shared knowledge of what it costs to pursue something the world has not yet agreed to reward. They knew each other before either of them was fully recognizable, which is its own kind of intimacy. And then 1962 arrived. The marriage that followed was not the same marriage that had existed before it. Not because love disappeared. Not because either of them chose distance. But because some losses change the air inside a house. Two people can carry the same wound in different bodies, different silences, and different ways of getting through the morning and still not find their way back to each other. Bruce went to work. He always went to work. The television episodes accumulated. The film roles came. The cowboys would later give him the kind of infamy the industry files under useful. Busy is one of the ways people who have lost something too large to process continue to function. You fill the hours. You show up to set. You find the truth inside a character, because finding the truth inside yourself is not currently available. Diane Ladd was doing the same thing. She was building her own career with the ferocity of a woman underestimated by an industry that underestimated most women. She was also carrying 1962 into every room she entered, into every role, into every morning that required her to be present and professional when part of her was still standing in a backyard in Los Angeles wondering how a spoon could change everything. They stayed married for 9 years after Diane Elizabeth died. 9 years is not nothing. It is a long time to keep choosing each other after the thing that made the choosing feel safe is no longer in the house. 9 years of work, travel, closeness, and distance. The closeness of two people who survived the unsurvivable together, and the distance of surviving in ways that did not quite match. Laura was born in 1967. She arrived into a marriage that was still standing but had been fundamentally altered. A house where the air had been different for 5 years. A family where two people who loved each other were also, in ways neither could fully explain, strangers to each other in the specific way shared catastrophe can make people strangers. Laura later described a childhood in which she was raised primarily by her mother and her maternal grandmother. Bruce was nearby. He was in Malibu, a short distance of miles and a longer distance in the geometry of a family reorganized by loss. He was not absent in the simplest sense, but he was present in a partial way. The way a man can be when his interior life has been claimed by grief, work, and the discipline of processing everything alone. The divorce came in 1969. Diane Ladd would later say, carefully, that losing Diane Elizabeth was the wound beneath every other wound. That what finally ended the marriage was not one simple event, one betrayal, or one clean rupture. It was the accumulated weight of two people who had tried to hold something together after the worst thing and reached the limit of what together could hold. She did not say it with bitterness. That matters. By the time she spoke of it, bitterness had been replaced by something more complicated and more honest, the understanding that some things cannot be survived without cost, and that the people who pay that cost together do not always come out facing the same direction. Bruce remarried in 1969. Her name was Andrea Beckett. That marriage became the quieter chapter of his personal life, the one that did not generate the kind of story interviews tend to reach for. It lasted in an industry and a life that had already shown him how quickly things can be taken. Lasting was not a small thing. But Diane Ladd did not disappear from his life when the marriage ended. That is one of the facts about Bruce Dern that does not fit neatly into Hollywood's usual divorce story. They remain close, not in a polished public relations way, in the actual way of two people who had been through something together that very few people could understand, and who knew that what they shared had not been erased by the legal end of the marriage. They co-parented Laura. They maintained a friendship that outlasted the marriage by decades. When Diane Ladd died in 2025, Bruce's public statement did not reach for romantic regret. He called her a wonderful mother. He called her a great teammate to her fellow actors. He described her as what she had been to him for the longest part of their relationship. The mother of his daughter, the woman who had carried the same loss, the person who had been there for the worst thing and remained close enough in some form for the rest of her life. Laura grew up watching both of them. She watched her mother build a career with relentless determination. She watched her father show up to set after set, year after year, playing men audiences despised and bringing each of them a seriousness those roles did not always deserve. She watched two people who had lost something irreplaceable find ways to continue, in different houses, in different lives, but in the same orbit. What she absorbed from that watching would not become fully visible until much later. For now, in 1969, Bruce Dern was 33 years old. He had lost a daughter. He had ended a marriage. He had a 2-year-old Laura being raised mostly by her mother in a house he did not live in. He had a career built almost entirely on the willingness of audiences to hate his face. And he had every morning the run, Malibu, the Pacific, the quiet of a city before it wakes up, the sound of the road, the breathing, the body doing what it has always known how to do. He ran. He kept running. It was the one thing that had never required anything from him except that he continue. By the early 1970s, Bruce Dern had built something. Not what he had set out to build. Not what the actor's studio training had pointed toward. But something real nonetheless. A reputation. a specific quality of presence the industry had learned to reach for when it needed someone the audience could believe was genuinely dangerous. Not cartoonishly dangerous. Not the kind that requires a costume or a musical cue. The other kind. The kind that arrives in ordinary clothes, speaks in a reasonable voice, and makes a room feel less safe than it looked 30 seconds earlier. Bruce had that quality. He had worked for years to develop the truth inside a character, and then watched the industry use that truth in the most efficient way possible. He was a villain. He was a coward. He was a man who broke. And at the same time, he was an actor of serious technical depth, bringing full interior work to roles that often had not been written to receive it. That gap between what the work actually was and what the audience believed the work to be defined the middle years of his career. Then came Silent Running. The year was 1972, the same year as The Cowboys, which tells you something about that strange moment in his career. The same calendar year contained both the role that made America hate him most and the role that first suggested there might be something else available. Silent Running was directed by Douglas Trumbull. It was not a major studio prestige film, and it did not create the same cultural conversation the Cowboys created. But it gave Bruce Dern something none of the villain roles had given him in 15 years. The center of the frame. He played Freeman Lowell, the last botanist in a future where Earth's forests have been destroyed and the remaining specimens survive inside a greenhouse spacecraft. When the order comes to destroy the greenhouse and return home, Lowell refuses. He kills his crewmates. He tends his plants alone in deep space, accompanied only by 3 small robots named Huey, Dewey, and Louie. It was not a comfortable role. Freeman Lowell was not a clean hero. He was a man so committed to the thing he was protecting that he became capable of violence in its service. He was right and wrong and alone, and for the first time in a Bruce Dern film, the audience was asked to stay with him for the entire story. Bruce later described Silent Running as the beginning of something different, not because the industry suddenly understood him. It did not, but because he understood something about what might be available to him. The interior work he had been doing on roles no one wanted to study closely could survive at the center of the film. He kept working. Coming Home arrived in 1978. Hal Ashby's film about the Vietnam War, and its cost was not primarily about Bruce Dern's character. It was about Jane Fonda and John Voight. But Bruce played Captain Bob Hyde, a husband who goes to Vietnam believing in something, and comes home having discovered that what he believed in and what he found there were not the same thing. The role required something he had not often been asked to provide on screen. Not menace, not controlled danger. Something rawer. The damage of a man whose certainty has been destroyed by experience and who does not have the tools to rebuild himself. He delivered it with a completeness the industry could not ignore. The Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor arrived in 1979. It did not erase the typecasting. It did not make him a leading man, but it cracked the ceiling. The face America had spent 15 years learning to hate belonged to an actor of genuine depth, and now the Academy had to acknowledge it. The 1980s brought a quieter recognition. In that championship season, the film adaptation of the Pulitzer Prize-winning play about former high school basketball teammates and the compromises of adulthood, Bruce won Best Actor at the Berlin Film Festival. Berlin, not Hollywood. A European festival looking at American actors with a different kind of attention. He accepted that kind of recognition with the calm of a man who had learned not to attach too much to what institutions decided. The work was the work. The awards were what other people decided the work was worth. Those were related, but they were not the same thing. Through all of it, the running continued. Every morning, through Malibu, through whatever city the work had taken him to, he ran. 10 miles, 12 miles. The kind of daily mileage most people associate with training for a race. Bruce was not training for a finish line. He was running because running regulated everything else. Before the day made its demands, before the industry called, before the roles asked him to be someone else, the body moving through space was still the one place he had found where the noise organized itself. By the 1980s, the knee had begun to hurt. Not the kind of hurt that stops a runner. The kind a runner negotiates with. The kind that becomes part of the morning. He adjusted. He ran differently. But he ran. And later, in the 1990s, even a man who never drank and never smoked would admit that pain had found another route into his life. He developed a dependency on Vicodin that lasted 5 years. At its worst, he said, it reached 27 pills a day. He did not turn it into a public confession tour. He dealt with it the way he dealt with most things, privately, stubbornly, and late. That detail matters because it complicates the myth of endurance. Endurance can look noble from the outside. From the inside, it can also look like a man asking his body to absorb more than it was meant to carry, then finding a way to keep going even after the body begins answering back. He kept showing up. He kept finding the truth inside whatever material he was handed, in the roles that deserved it and in the roles that did not. The stubbornness his teachers had once treated like a limitation was becoming the foundation of everything that would eventually matter. He was still the fifth cowboy. He was also, quietly, something else entirely. Alexander Payne called him in 2012. The conversation was not, by Bruce Dern's own account, some grand announcement of destiny. It was a director and an actor talking about a role. A character named Woody Grant, an elderly man in Billings, Montana, who believes he has won $1 million in a sweepstakes promotion and insists on traveling to Lincoln, Nebraska, to collect it, even though everyone around him knows the prize almost certainly does not exist. Woody Grant was not glamorous. He was old, stubborn, slightly confused, and not especially interested in being understood. He did not have the kind of speeches that awards clips are built around. What he had was harder to manufacture, a complete interior life beneath the surface of every moment, visible not in what he said, but in the weight of his presence. Bruce understood Woody from the inside. He understood the stubbornness. He understood the refusal to be redirected by people who believed they knew better. He understood the dignity of a man underestimated for so long that he had stopped expecting anything different. And he understood what it felt like to move through the world in a body that was negotiating with time. He was 76 when Nebraska went into production. He had been running for more than 50 years. The knee that had begun hurting in the 1980s had been managed for decades. He wore hearing aids now, small visible devices that spoke quietly of the body's accommodations. He brought all of it to Woody Grant. Every mile, every roll, every year being underestimated, every morning that required him to locate something real and carry it into the work. One detail from the filming says more about his method than any speech could. There's a sequence in Nebraska where Woody walks along the shoulder of a freeway. During filming, Bruce removed his hearing aids. Not because the scene required deafness, because Woody, in Bruce's understanding, existed in a kind of partial disconnection from the noise around him. Bruce did not want to perform that disconnection. He wanted to experience it. A real police officer approached him from behind during the shoot. Bruce did not hear him coming. His reaction, the startle, the turn, the look of a man genuinely surprised by a presence he had not registered, was real. It stayed in the film. That was Strasberg's lesson 60 years later, still alive in an old man on a Nebraska freeway, not indicating an interior state, locating it, using the body's real condition in service of the character's truth. Nebraska opened at Ken in 2013. Ken has always had a particular way of looking at American actors. It does not always watch the same way Hollywood watches. It is less concerned with weekend box office, franchise potential, or studio positioning. It watches the work. And in Nebraska, Bruce Dern's work was a kind Ken knew how to recognize. He won Best Actor. He was 77 years old. Think about that number for a moment, not as a feel-good statistic about late bloomers, as a fact about what 60 years of work actually looks like when the mythology is stripped away. 60 years of showing up. 60 years of finding the truth inside whatever material was available. 60 years of running before the city woke up and then going to set with the same seriousness he had brought to the actor's studio when he was told to sit down and be quiet for a year. The Academy Award nomination followed. Best Actor. His name was finally in the category, reserved for work the industry had decided it could not ignore. He did not win the Oscar. He was nominated. He attended. He sat in a room where Hollywood organizes its annual conversation about what it values, heard his name read aloud, and then heard another name called when the envelope opened. He has spoken about the loss with a particular calm of a man who had learned decades earlier not to locate his understanding of the work inside other people's assessments of it. The comprise was real. The nomination was real. The work was real. The rest was what other people decided the work was worth. But something did change after Nebraska. Not overnight. Not cleanly. More gradually. The way understanding sometimes arrives after enough time has passed for earlier dismissals to look like what they actually were. People started watching the old films differently. The villain roles that had defined him for years were now being revisited by audiences who knew what he could do. And in the old performances, they found what he had always put there: the interior logic, the humanity under the menace, the truth inside men the scripts had treated as functions. The fifth cowboy, it turned out, had been doing serious work in roles the industry had filed under background. And yet recognition did not change the basic rhythm of the man. He was still running, still managing the body's account, still wearing the hearing aids when the day required them, still taking them out if the work asked for something truer, still showing up, not because recognition had finally arrived and he could stop proving something, but because showing up had become less a choice than a condition. The fifth cowboy, still running, still there. There's a photograph from November 1st, 2010. 3 people standing on Hollywood Boulevard. Bruce Dern, Diane Ladd, Laura Dern. Their names pressed into 3 stars on the sidewalk beside them, side by side, the way the Hollywood Walk of Fame had never arranged a family before. The ceremony was described as historic. The first time a family received adjoining stars on the same day. From the outside, it looked like a celebration. From the inside, it was more complicated than that, as things involving this particular family often were. Bruce and Diane had been divorced for 41 years by then. They had co-parented Laura across decades of separate lives, separate careers, separate houses. They had found a way to remain close, not because the marriage had been simple, but because they shared something that could not be divided. Not the romance, not the legal history, the loss that had preceded Laura's birth and shaped the atmosphere of everything that followed. Standing on Hollywood Boulevard that day, all 3 of them understood something the cameras could not fully capture. Being seen together, publicly and permanently, was something they had reached by a route no one watching the ceremony would have chosen for them. Laura had grown up in the partial presence of a father whose life was divided between work, grief, and the private discipline of a man who processed everything alone. She was raised primarily by her mother and maternal grandmother. Bruce was not absent in the simplest sense, but he was not present in the ordinary dailiness of fatherhood either. She built her own extraordinary career in that partial light, carrying his name, her mother's talent, and something entirely her own. At 25, in Rambling Rose, Laura stood beside her mother on screen. The film earned both Laura and Diane Ladd Academy Award nominations in the same year, making them the first mother and daughter in Oscar history to do that together. Bruce watched from the sidelines. He later said he was very proud of them. 3 words. Very proud of them. The sentence of a man who has learned that some feelings are diminished rather than elevated by elaboration. But the sidelines were where he had been. The Walk of Fame ceremony in 2010 was one of the rare days when the sidelines disappeared. For a few minutes, the family stood in the same physical space, under the same lights, with the same official acknowledgement pressed into the ground beneath all of them. It was not a resolution. Nothing in this family story resolves that cleanly, but it was something. Then came 2024. Apple TV Plus cast Bruce and Laura together in Palm Royale, a period comedy set in 1969 Palm Beach. He played Robert Folds, a character whose relationship to Laura's character required them to navigate, on screen, the dynamics of father and daughter whose history is complicated and whose present is not simple. It was the first time Bruce Dern and Laura Dern had appeared on screen together in roles that formally required them to be father and daughter. Not as background, not as context, as the actual emotional center of their scenes together. Laura described it afterward as one of the great experiences of their life together, not just their professional lives. Their life, that word mattered. She was describing something that had happened between them as people, not only as actors. Bruce described the first scene differently. He said he heard her voice before he saw her. She was off camera, approaching, and he heard the sound of her before she came to the door, carrying a prop. His reaction in the scene, the recognition, complication, and love the character required, came from something real. He had been doing that for 60 years. Finding the real thing inside the rehearsed thing. With Laura, in 2024, the real thing was not difficult to locate. He was 87. She was 56. Between them were decades of things said, things not said, and things the work allowed them to communicate in a way ordinary conversation had never fully managed. Laura said the show explored sins of the father, grief, ego, and privilege. She was describing the characters. She may also have been describing something else. And then, in 2025, Diane Ladd died. She was 87 years old. She had been acting for 6 decades. She had raised Laura with the ferocity of a woman who had survived catastrophe and chosen to build from what remained. She had stayed close to Bruce across more than 4 decades of separated lives, in the way 2 people sometimes do when they've been through the unsurvivable together. Bruce's statement was brief. He called her a wonderful mother. He called her a great teammate to her fellow actors. He described her in the terms of what she had actually been to him for the longest portion of their relationship. The mother of his daughter, the woman who had been in the room for the worst thing, and the person who had carried what it left behind with him. He did not perform grief for an audience. He said what was true and left it there. Laura was now standing on the other side of a loss that children with complicated parents eventually come to understand. She still had her father. She had her children, Ellery and Jaya, who carried a continuation of a family that had been broken open in 1962 and had been finding its way back toward itself in partial, imperfect increments ever since. In early 2026, a filmmaker named Mike Mendez approached Bruce about a documentary. The conversations that produced Dernsey, the amazing life of Bruce Dern, began, characteristically, not in a studio or production office, but at an IHOP. Breakfast, Bruce talking in the looping, associated way he always talked, moving not through memory as a straight line, but through images, feelings, and scenes he had never fully stopped living inside. The film took shape around those conversations. It would include Diane Ladd, not in person. She was gone by the time the film was finished. But in footage, in the record of a face and voice that had been part of the story since 1960. She appeared in the film as an absence that was also a presence. There in the footage, gone from the room, Bruce kept working. He kept running, or something like running, the body's modified version of what it had once done without modification. His daughter was beside him. His grandchildren were there. And Ken was coming. On May 20th, 2026, the Cannes Film Festival screened a documentary about Bruce Dern. Not a tribute reel, not a brief montage attached to an award. A real film, built from the conversations that began at an IHOP breakfast table and followed Bruce through his memories, his stories, and a particular way of moving through the world. The film was called Dernsey, The Amazing Life of Bruce Dern. Bruce was there. He was 89 years old, and that alone is worth sitting with for a moment. Not everyone who spends 65 years in industry lives long enough to watch a documentary about his life screen at Cannes. Not everyone gets a documentary at all. He wore a black tuxedo and a Los Angeles Dodgers cap. Laura was beside him. She wore silver. Behind them stood her children, Ellery and Jaya, completing the picture the cameras recognized immediately. 3 generations. One complicated family. The lights of Cannes. The cameras loved the image. But the image, like all images, was also a record of what was not in it. Diane Ladd was not there. The woman whose voice had been part of the story since 1960, who appeared in Dernsey only as footage, only as a record of a presence the film itself could not restore, had died the year before. She had died the year before. And Dernsey would carry her only as footage, the record of a voice and a face the film itself could not restore. That absence was visible if you knew where to look, and there was another absence, the one that had never fully left any photograph, interview, award ceremony, morning run, or role Bruce completed after 1962. Diane Elizabeth, the daughter who never grew up, the daughter who never stood on a red carpet, never watched her father receive a prize, never brought her own children to meet him. She was not in the photograph. She had never been in any photograph like that. In the documentary, Bruce said the sentence he has been saying for decades. You never get over it. The Cannes screening was a full house. People who had watched Bruce Dern for decades, who had grown up with his face as the face of danger, and then watched Nebraska reframe that face as something else, sat in a theater in the south of France and watched a film about a man they thought they knew, and discovered they had only known the surface. After the screening, Bruce spoke to reporters. He said something that stopped people. He said he had never become a big star, not with bitterness, not with performed modesty, with the plain tone of someone making an accurate assessment of a career that had produced more than 150 credits, a Cannes Best Actor, an Oscar nomination, a Hollywood Walk of Fame star, and now a documentary playing to a full house at one of the most prestigious film festivals in the world. He had never become a big star. He meant it in a specific sense. He once explained that, to him, a big star was someone who could open a film to $50 million on the first weekend. He had never been that. What 65 years had produced instead was something harder to name and harder to dismiss. A body of work. A record. The accumulated evidence of a man who showed up fully to every role he was handed, whether or not the role deserved it, whether or not the audience was paying attention, whether or not the industry knew what to call him. Laura stood beside him and told reporters that her father was a runner first and then an actor. She said it with the authority of someone who had watched him run since before she understood what running meant. Since the years when she was being raised primarily by her mother while Bruce was in Malibu, going out before dawn, covering miles along the Pacific in the silence of a man who had found, in forward motion, the one thing no one else could arrange for him or take from him. Runner first, then actor. The Dodgers cap on the Cannes red carpet was not an accident. It was not a fashion trick. It was Bruce being exactly who he had always been, without adjusting himself for the occasion, the cameras, or the expectations a moment like that usually creates. He had spent 89 years refusing to fit the shape other people made for him. He was not going to start at Cannes. Ellery and Jaya stood behind him and Laura, representing something the original story might once have made seem impossible. In 1962, a backyard pool had taken the first daughter. The marriage had not survived what the loss left behind. Laura had been raised in the partial light of two parents who loved her from separate houses and somehow kept the family from fully dissolving. And now, 64 years later, Laura's children were there. Bruce's grandchildren, standing on a red carpet and at a screening of a documentary about a man who had been told he would never be more than the fifth cowboy, who never stopped running, who lost the one thing endurance could not bring back and carried that loss into every room he entered. The industry had not always known what to do with Bruce Dern. It filed him under useful, then under underestimated, then, after Nebraska, under overlooked genius. The category criticism reaches for when it needs to explain a talent it failed to recognize, while recognition still had time to matter in conventional sense. But the audience in Kim was not there because of a category. They were there because of the work, because of 65 years of showing up, because of Woody Grant on a Nebraska freeway with his hearing aids in his pocket, because of the fifth cowboy who kept showing up until the world ran out of reasons to look away. After the screening, after the questions, after the photograph that would travel across entertainment pages, showing 3 generations under the same lights, Bruce Dern left that room with almost everything a man can ask for at 89. A film about his life, a daughter beside him, grandchildren behind him, a career finally being seen with the patience it had always required. And still, somewhere in the back of that evening, there was a daughter who had been 18 months old in 1962 and was not there, who had never been there, who would not be there for any of the evenings that followed. You never get over it. Present tense. Ongoing. The way a runner describes a course he is still on. For decades, America saw Bruce Dern as a face that trusted itself to hate. The villain. The coward. The man who shot John Wayne in the back while the audience sat in the dark and felt something it had not expected to feel. The fifth cowboy to the right. Background. Functional. Present without maturing. That was the version the industry filed him under for years. But now, after Ken, after Dernsey, after 89 years of a life that refused to fit the shape anyone had prepared for it, we understand something different. He was never just a fifth cowboy. He was a man who showed up every day to roles nobody was watching closely and brought them the full weight of everything he had. He found the interior logic of men the script had written as functions. He made them real in ways the audience did not always want and could not entirely ignore. He was also the man who lost a daughter in 1962 and carried that loss into every room he entered for the rest of his life. Not as a wound he displayed, not as a story he offered whenever an interviewer needed something personal. As a fact about the interior of a man that no camera ever fully captured and no role ever fully contained. You never get over it. He said that at 89 at Ken, with a documentary about his life playing to a full house, with Laura beside him, his grandchildren behind him, and Diane Ladd visible only in footage. Present tense. Ongoing. The way a runner describes a course he is still on. That is what endurance meant in Bruce Dern's life. Not triumph without damage. Not recognition, arriving in time to repair what had been taken. Endurance meant continuing after the thing that should have stopped you did not stop the world. It meant showing up the next morning, even when the person missing from the photograph would still be missing. Laura said her father was a runner first, and then an actor. Maybe that is the simplest way to understand him. He ran from the shape Kenilworth had prepared for him. He ran through the years when Hollywood trusted him only as a villain. He ran through roles no one expected to matter, through pain, through a body that eventually began to answer back, through recognition that came late and losses that never left. not because the finish line was visible, because stopping was never the way he survived. At Cannes, the world saw an old actor in a Dodgers cap standing with his daughter and grandchildren. It saw 3 generations under the lights. It saw a documentary, a full house, a career finally being looked at with the patience it had always required. But by now, we know what else was in that frame. A wife who was gone, a first daughter who never grew up, a family that had survived, but not without cost. And maybe that is why Bruce Dern's story still matters. Not because every wound becomes wisdom, not because every long road ends in applause, but because some people keep going without the promise that going will make anything whole again. He never stopped running. And finally, the world ran out of reasons to look away. What does Bruce Dern's story mean to you? Was it The Cowboys, the film that made America hate his face? Was it Nebraska, the film that made America look at that face differently? Or was it the red carpet in 2026, 3 generations under the same lights with 2 people missing from frame? Leave your answer in the comments. And tell us what city you are watching from tonight. If the story moved you, leave a like and subscribe. Because stories like his, the ones built slowly without the crowd permission, are the ones worth keeping. We will keep bringing back the lives Hollywood never fully told.